I'm a doctoral student at Capella University, and I'm going to talk about my capstone project. I wrote about people who experience houselessness. We often say people who are homeless, but I didn't write about people who are homeless. I wrote about the systemic gaps in services, the role of the workers, and how we define houselessness. It's easy to call people who don't have a residence homeless because it's a quick way of saying they don't have a place to live. But people are not defined by their situations. And it's important for us to see them as having experiences that promoted or fostered their houselessness. But for a residence and no problematic situations, they would do fine. The problems that cause people to become houseless is what sustains them in shelters. There are 500,000, at least, people in the United States who experience houselessness. There are categories of homelessness. Houselessness is a category of homelessness. There are 4 categories of homelessness. One is houselessness, which means that a person doesn't have a residence apartment, an apartment, or a house, however you interpret that. Another one is insecure housing. I'm living in my mother's house and she throws me out every Tuesday because she gets angry with me. An insecure housing situation would be someone who is a squatter. The most problematic is the person who is roofless, because in some parts of the world and some parts of the United States, rooflessness and homelessness are the only categories. Homelessness means you don't have a place to live and you're living outdoors. No place to stay, living in the park, living in the woods, wherever you're living, but you don't have anything covering your head. Or maybe you do have something covering your head. Rooflessness, conversely, is living outdoors in an encampment or in a car with something over your head. And if a person is roofless, they may not be eligible for financial assistance because their head is covered. And it's the most ruthless of all government policies, because having a place to sit with my umbrella over my head does not mean I'm not subject to inclement weather. Doesn't mean that I have a comfortable place to live. It's not a bed. It's not something where I'm paying rent or something that means that I'll be able to stay there. Any cop could come along and say, move it along. But as long as your head is covered, you have a place to stay. This is where policies, we call these macro problems. These are problems that our governments create. And as a result of that kind of creation, we end up with people living on the streets and not having adequate assistance. When I ask a person, how do they define houselessness? It's never related to any one of the categories. It's simply that the person doesn't have a place to stay. They don't have a place to call home. That, of course, is problematic, but it sets in motion the kind of situation where we are only looking at the people and considering them the problem. Not that they've had situations that created the problem. It's that they are the problem. If they would just get a job, if they had a place to live, if they this or if they that. But people are houseless because of their experiences. They experience houselessness because they experience something else or many other things. Job loss, mental illness, lack of public assistance, whatever that situation is that created their houselessness is what needs to be addressed. When I conducted the study to determine what services could best help social workers develop systems that reduce the incidence of houselessness, the response was really very interesting. Social workers, one, are not people who have any training in working with people who experience houselessness. They have never worked in shelter service. It's never been a job category in shelter service. But oddly, they're often blamed for homelessness as if they created it. What I wanted to do, because in some way we make a contribution, but I want to draw the line so that we understand what contribution we make. Social workers write biopsychosocial assessments. And I don't want to make that longer because it could be biopsychosocial spiritual assessments. Let's just do biopsychosocial assessments. We talk about a person's medical condition. We talk about their psychiatric condition. We talk about their condition that strongholds them in their situation. This situation being houselessness. What I wanted to do was try to bring all of the systems together to help develop a practice that would elucidate how we need to help. And we don't need to help by blaming people for their situations. They're not responsible in many situations for their situation. An example of that I think is most important is COVID, where people lost their job, lost their apartments, lost, and then began to experience depression, anxiety, some kind of psychiatric disorder, that just made them feel like they could not stop falling. So we don't want to define them by their situation. We want to explain their situation and create interventions that help them. But that is very difficult if we're defining houselessness simply by saying that a person doesn't have a residence. So after defining houselessness, I asked, what's a typical interaction between you and a houseless person? And the typical interaction is helping the person understand their situations. I asked case managers, social workers, entitlement specialists, and housing specialists. And consistently, I was told that the typical interaction was helping the person understand their situation and trying to get them or motivate them or do this with them or do that with them. And see, that in and of itself suggests that the problem is the people, not the situations they're in. So it's pretty hard to help them if you're seeing them as a problem. But the salient responses was mental health services, physical conditions that prevented them from working, prevented them from even looking for a place to live, and substance abuse problems, lack of employment, lack of vocational training, lack of skills that might even promote job training. So we have those resources that are missing. The housing specialist, who is responsible for locating housing, is the rock star in shelter services, because their job is to reduce the numbers, locate housing, work with realtors, and reduce homelessness. It's almost impossible when there are so many interferences, so many situations that are set up that prevent this person from finding a job or even looking for an apartment along with the housing specialist, which, by the way, they have to have some income. So what happens is the housing specialist becomes pretty frustrated that they can't produce the apartments so that a person can live. But the reason they can't produce these apartments because all of the services need to be specialized. Because the typical interaction isn't that a person needs to find a job. A typical interaction for them is noticing that the person has a serious and persistent mental health problem, has a substance abuse problem, is not employable for a multitude of reasons. Some people are learning disabled. Some people have lived on the street too long. Some people lived on the street not very long, but are dealing with new problems. Those are the new houseless, the people who have been houseless as a result of COVID. So the housing specialist can no longer just transfer people into apartments because there are so many other issues that have to be taken into consideration. They have to work with an entitlement specialist that they never really had to work with before, because they're the housing specialists, and what they do is locate housing. The entitlement specialist has to help people to get employment, help them to locate some kind of training, help them to get identification cards. A simple problem can really block a housing specialist is identification. What's your social security number? Where's your ID? Do you have public assistance? Are you eligible for public assistance? During the interview, one of the entitlement specialists said to me that she spends 3 to 4 hours working on a housing application. That includes downloading it and helping the person fill it out. And in a shelter, you might have 100 people. And even if you have 2 housing specialists, you end up doing maybe 10 entitlement applications in a week. And then you have a case manager who sees themselves as managing a case. So the case manager has more authority than the social worker, because the case manager must interview the person who experiences houselessness. They're the ones who gather all of the information and then make the referrals. Social workers write the biopsychosocial assessments that can really tell everybody in a shelter what a person's needs are, but it's not thorough. It's not thorough because it's not because they're not making it thorough. It's because it doesn't really address the situations that people have. And because it doesn't address the situations, the case manager might read the biopsychosocial assessment and not consider all of the other challenges this person has, because the ultimate goal in a shelter is housing. It's housing placement. And until we start looking at how people are placed, we're going to always have people who experience houselessness. We're going to always have people in shelter services, and we'll always have people who live on the street because their needs are not being addressed. My recommendation is simple. We come to the table every week and discuss our service users. We don't think of them as clients. This is a language that's hard even for me to change. I've been around for a long time. We say clients. But the people we work with are service users. We have a service and they're using it. We come to the table and talk about what's needed. The social worker talks about the biopsychosocial problems. And they do it this way. Mr. Johnson is a 42-year-old African-American man with a history of psychiatric hospitalizations. He now has diabetes. We think the best option for him is support services and supportive housing. That says that this person should be placed somewhere where there are other social workers and case managers and entitlements people who can guide their process and help them into a more independent situation. Instead, we have everybody doing a different job. And they're not working together. But it's not that they're not working together because they don't want to work together. They absolutely want to work together. My experience was so heartfelt. I was so impressed that each group wanted to work with the other group. But the way the system is designed, this is the systemic gap. The system is designed to keep people separate. So table A almost never knows what table B is doing. And when you start moving people out of their comfort zones and having them work together, initially, I think there's some pushback, but it's not pushback because of their dislike or disrespect for one another. It's pushback because the goal in shelter services is to locate housing, regardless of what a person's psychiatric or medical needs are. Medical includes substance abuse. Regardless of what those needs are, the goal is housing. The problem is that as long as we're looking at the discharge planning effort to just discharge people, we're not creating sustainable housing situations. And people are less likely to sustain tenancy if they cannot get into places where they are comfortable and they feel safe. That's the challenge. One of my other recommendations is we create a resource directory. A resource directory tells everybody in homeless services who's in what district and what's in the district. And I think that there are people who leave their apartments and move back into shelter services because they have lived in District 16 in a shelter for 3 or 4 years, and then we put them in District 25 where they don't even know where the laundromat is, where the pharmacy is. They don't know where any of the services are, and they feel isolated. So my recommendation would be that we create a resource directory specifically for people who are houseless. And I started that within the corporation where I conducted the study. And they get it. They understand the need. They understand that when you see someone sitting on the street who's been there every day, you walk past this person, these workers will stop and say, is there something that I can do? So it starts with understanding the people, understanding their need for resources, and needing to work together. Shelter service organizations often have people work differently. And administrations sometimes believe that the cure is money and an apartment until we ask, would you like him to be your neighbor? Then it becomes a different issue. Because the very person that's running around beating up these senior citizens, oh, it's okay to put them in a neighborhood, just not mine. So we have to get them services. I think, and I believe this after 27 years of being a social worker, and 3 years prior to that working in case management services, I believe at my core, people are generally good. And with improved assistance and more cohesiveness around their needs, they'll do better. They'll know better and they'll do better. So, I want to thank you for this interview. When I started this process, I didn't mention that my brother was homeless. And I couldn't understand how come no one could help him. And I work with everybody's sister or brother. And we help. This project seeks to close systemic gaps and bring people together and encourage their working together. Not their competition, because there's no competition in this matter. It's everybody working together to close a systemic gap to produce housing situations that are sustainable and introduce people to their new communities so that they could live and grow and thrive. So thank you so much for this interview.